The plain of Bloomburrow is home to a wide array of charming and colorful creatures, people with rich histories and distinct personalities, only they're not people in a traditional sense. Bloomburrow doesn't just lack a native humanoid population, the very idea of humans is non-existent on the plain. Instead, this world is made up of adorable animal folk, different species of semi-anthropomorphized creatures who make up the fabric of Bloomburrow society. And in this video, we'll break down and explain each of the animal folk you can find on the plain of Bloomburrow. First, what exactly are animal folk? Well, they're exactly what they appear to be. Small animals of various species who have intelligence and autonomy, who've built cities, societies, and customs all their own. While it would be easy to classify them as anthropomorphic, that isn't really the case. They aren't humanized versions of animals, rather they're simply just animals, only ones that have evolved cultures. The main distinction here is their size. Anthropomorphic animals are typically humanoids that take on animal traits. Typically, this would be visualized by a person of normal height with fur or horns, etc. The animal folk of Bloomburrow are the actual size of the animals they intended to be. So when you see a mouse folk, for example, they're actually the size of a mouse. They also have shorter lifespans when compared to humans, but it's not entirely clear if they live as long as, say, normal frogs, which is to say, substantially shorter. It's also unclear what it would look like if an animal folk were to leave Bloomburrow to another plane via an omen path. Would they be the size of a mouse found on Innistrad? One thing we do know is that planeswalker visitors who travel to Bloomburrow actually take on the size and appearance of one of the animal folk denizens there. This prevents outsiders from coming in and simply overpowering the native population. Why this happens is still a mystery, but it's believed to be some protective magic shielding the plane from the endless threats that could spell its doom. In Bloomburrow, the majority of the story centers around a region called Valley, a rich society full of diverse species that all lend a hand in keeping their lives safe and prosperous. Each major species plays a role in Valley's society and help to ensure its continued growth. While at first glance, many of these species share little in common, they all believe in their shared survival and will work together regardless of differences in order to achieve it. As a collective effort, the animal folk of Bloomburrow stand unified against a world filled with roaming disasters that threaten their very existence. Now that we know about animal folk in general, let's get into the specific species that make up the unique society of Bloomburrow. The Frogfolk of Bloomburrow are some of the most idolized and respected of the small folk thanks to the crucial role they play in protecting its weaker citizens from the scourge that are the Calamity Beasts. Calamity Beasts are natural, elementally formed forces of nature that bring about great change wherever they roam. While seen as inherently destructive, they're without true malice and act more like changing seasons or natural disasters. Still, the small folk try as they can to avoid them. This is where the Frogfolk and their powers as augurs come into play. Frogfolk are deeply connected to their world, understanding its deep complexities and how to manipulate the natural order just enough to see immense change. They can peer into the future through visions, track the paths of calamity beasts, allowing others to avoid them. And in some cases, a powerful enough mage can even nudge the path of a calamity beast to spare entire villages. Frogfolk make natural mages, using the weave of mana found on Bloomburrow into spells typically utilizing water. While oftentimes this materializes as jets of water or a forceful wave, some mages can craft portals through water, allowing them to escape or project attacks from afar at their unsuspecting enemies. Still, others of Valley see the Frogfolk in a bit of a foreboding light. Because of their ominous visions, they're seen as bringers of doom, animals haunted by dark visions that seem inescapable. They do a lot of talk about doom and gloom as a result, and consider the other animal folk naive for not sharing their concerns. Still, most Frogfolk see it as their duty to help others escape a fate that only they can see coming. Mousefolk, while small, are some of Bloomburrow's strongest inhabitants, not because of their size or strength, but thanks to their strong determination and unrivaled sense of heroism. Of all the animal folk on the plane, the Mousefolk are the most likely to rise and meet great challenges. They're the first to offer up their sword to a righteous cause in the defense of the weak, displaying unbridled optimism, loyalty, and a bit of irresponsibility. To the Mousefolk, there's no greater honor in life than serving your community and your family with bravery. They employ a number of trials to help determine the mettle of their peers, but being heroic doesn't always mean facing down some gigantic calamity beast. Sometimes even just lending a hand to a friend in need is enough for one to become a hero. For the Mousefolk, heroism isn't about some outward reward. Simply the act of being heroic is in itself its own reward. Being action-oriented, Mousefolk have a deep sense of familial pride, coming from large families always looking to protecting the weakest amongst them. Yet, while well-intended, they often act without much planning, their desire to be heroic oftentimes leading them down dangerous paths unnecessarily. While others see their small stature and expect an easy fight, Mousefolk always find a way to exceed expectations through skill, determination, and their unique brand of magic weaving. Using their small size, Mousefolk regularly lend their enemies a false sense of confidence in battle. But as the enemy strikes, they enhance themselves with magic, augmenting their speed and strength. Mousefolk can become so quick that they're seen as blurs or an afterimage, allowing them to attack with blows far more powerful than their frames could naturally produce. With all this, Mousefolk, despite their size, often claim victory and heroism over incalculable odds. Squirrelfolk are solitary, magically inclined animal folk who only work with others of value when totally necessary. They choose to rather focus more on themselves, making them incredibly self-reliant, but a bit standoffish and dismissive as well. They're a pragmatic group, thinking strictly in logical terms while having a deep understanding of the cycles found in nature, with a particular affinity for the cycle of life and death. This makes them appear to worship death, which is a bit off-putting to the other animal folk. But in truth, Squirrelfolk just recognize that death is an integral part of life. They use this understanding, combined with their magic, to help cultivate the farmland of Valley, revitalizing barren soil with fresh nutrients found in the decaying rot of nature. While aiding in food production, Squirrelfolk also prepare for unforeseeable calamities. Sudden changes in seasons brought about by the calamity beasts could see an entire harvest wiped out in an instant, so they take it upon themselves to store caches of food using varying preservation methods. So, at the very least, should the worst happen, the whole of Valley wouldn't starve. Death is an important aspect of Squirrelfolk society, for all things that live die, and all that dies can be reborn through the transfer of nutrients. This is true for all things, including the calamity beasts. One of their solemn duties is the disposal of fallen calamity beasts. The Squirrelfolk believe that calamity beasts contain the very essence of nature within them, the magic that once controlled the seasonal changes, trapped now in physical form. So, when a calamity beast dies, they bury its remains strategically around Valley, hoping that its essence can return to nature and bring about balance. Their reputation being a bit sullied is mostly tied to their use of necromancy in their spells. While it's mostly used to help regrow nature, traditional necromancy, i.e. raising the corpses of the dead and controlling them, is done as well. While doing this to a fallen animal folk of Valley is considered extremely taboo and rarely done, many Squirrelfolk still practice this magic on the corpses of insects and even the bones of calamity beasts, seeing this as the ultimate control over the domain of death. Otterfolk are some of the most talented mages found on Bloomburrow, while also being some of its least disciplined in the art of spellcraft. The Otterfolk do not concern themselves with stuffy study lessons or preening through endless pages of literature. They'd rather learn on the fly, living their lessons out there in the real world, facing danger with a smile and jovial disposition that oftentimes finds them in precarious positions. To the Otterfolk, all of life is one big game. There's always time for fun, even in the middle of a treacherous adventure. This means it can be somewhat careless at times, but it's through these experiences that they learn the bounds of their abilities. Otterfolk are the masters of Bloomburrow's waterways, mastering the intricacies of its rivers and ponds, preferring to spend as much of their lives as possible in the water. Most of their magical talent is related to manipulating water, but equally as prominent is their affinity for lightning magic. Its unpredictable and wild nature, some believe, matches their own dispositions. In life, Otterfolk have two great loves: a game called Otterball and a dangerous practice called storm chasing. Otterball is a mysterious game to the other animal folk. They gather to watch it be played, but its rules aren't known by any but the Otterfolk. In truth, Otterball is constantly changing, as the game itself is endless. One important aspect of the game seems to be the use of trapped elemental lightning. This, the Otterfolk collect through storm chasing. Storm chasing is the art of following calamity beasts as close as possible, with some brave Otterfolk even stealing pieces of the beast's fur. This essence contains raw elemental power, which the Otterfolk often trap in clamshells. Despite their exciting lives, Otterfolk still feel a duty to Valley society, serving as expert fishers and divers, providing their neighbors with the bounty of their watery homes. All this while staying true to their danger-seeking nature. Batfolk, the resident nocturnal citizens of Bloomburrow, are the stewards and protectors of the night. Most of the other animal folk of Valley are diurnal, sleeping through the night, leaving them vulnerable to rogue calamity beast attacks. The Batfolk believe it is their solemn duty to patrol and guard those asleep, ensuring a peaceful transfer from the darkened night to the rising day. Batfolk take their responsibility very seriously, as their traditions and customs are based in religious beliefs. They follow a rigid hierarchy, with strict rules and edicts that govern their day-to-day, or night-to-night, activities. The other animal folk describe them as being obtuse, as they're often deep in thought, contemplating astral signs they read in the starry night sky. Their religion is based on charting the stars and forming constellations, recording any cosmic movement, and interpreting what that could mean. The cosmos is the pillar of Batfolk culture. They turn to the uniformity of its patterns, with all of its certainties, to govern how they go about their lives. The Batfolk believe that reading the stars can give you a glimpse into the future and help guide your choices, making many of this creed perfect fortune tellers for the other animal folk. While many Batfolk take on the role of spiritual leaders or astral mages, there are a number of strong, martial Batfolk out there who defend Valley at night with valor. In truth, the path of a Batfolk isn't theirs to decide. It's up to the stars, their roles predetermined by forces beyond their reckoning. Still, one thing remains a constant in Batfolk society, that they're fierce protectors of the Valley's citizens. Rabbitfolk are very mild-mannered and warm-hearted. They care little for adventure and more so for tending to their families and communities. They're peaceful and hospitable, often leading others to misjudge them as cowards. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Rabbitfolk live in large communes on vast territories of farmland, which they work in order to feed the whole of Valley. Without their devotion to hard work, the structure of this society would falter and descend into famine. Because they work so closely with others, Rabbitfolk have a deep appreciation for collaboration. As such, they're an agreeable folk, choosing to politely let offenses slide rather than confront them with any hostility. Still, there's a level of competitiveness amongst the Rabbitfolk, with each family trying harder and harder to out-polite the other. Inviting Rabbitfolk to a party is often seen as a double-edged sword, as they'll undoubtedly offer far more generous contributions, but may also arrive far in advance to ensure timeliness, often getting in the way. Rabbitfolk are a simple group, focusing on the land, growing things, cooking, and ensuring the community is strong. Complex issues and tough choices often rattle their minds, leaving them confused. To the Rabbitfolk, the only issues worth worrying about are those with simple solutions. To reflect this, the magic they've mastered often works its way through the soil, spreading nutrients to crops and even healing the sick and injured. They take the bounty offered to them by nature and with respect use it to help their community. Now, while Rabbitfolk don't seemingly make the best warriors, there are those known to fight for their communities when the situation calls for it. The bravest and brawniest of Rabbitfolk join the Paw Patch Party, guards who patrol the farmlands scouting for calamity beasts and keeping the peace. Their relatively large size makes them surprisingly effective fighters, though most would prefer tending to crops and preparing a delicious meal. The Racoonfolk of Bloomburrow are true free spirits, animals that follow their own path with no true sense of specific place in the world. It's considered a rite of passage for Racoonfolk to head out into the greater wilderness of Valley, deep into the brambles, in search of adventure, self-discovery, and, of course, mementos. If anything, Racoonfolk are always great sources of incredible stories, their eyes constantly focusing on the next rough path their journey could take them down. Because of their free spirits, Racoonfolk are often described as aloof and unreliable. Their impulsive nature can derail their tasks and trains of thought, leading them to wander around in metaphorical and literal circles, returning to their party with no real acknowledgement or apology. For it's the never-ending search for the novel that is at its core what it means to be a Racoonfolk. Spending so much time out in the wilderness means Racoonfolk inherit a deep understanding of the natural world, and the weaving mana that flows through it. This leads many Racoonfolk to become druids, harnessers of the wilds, using energy to manipulate flora to aid them. This attachment to nature also influences their obsession with collecting rubbish, what they may call mementos and trinkets, others would call trash. While mementos could be anything from a discarded teacup to a pebble, they hold immense value to the Racoonfolk that carries it. It's a permanent reminder of some adventure they embarked on, some trial they overcame. Whatever the meaning behind it, mementos hold the very memories and experiences of its owner, making this quote-unquote trash incredibly important to them. While they'll often drift in and out of companies, their size makes Racoonfolk some of the strongest creatures in Valley. As such, they're employed as muscle to projects and adventuring parties, so long as they keep their interests, that is. As the only non-native citizens of Valley, Lizardfolk have customs and practices that are often seen as odd to the other animal folk. Coming from a far-off land of heat and dryness, these traveled Lizardfolk have made a home for themselves in the low cliffs on the outskirts of Valley, and have slowly been incorporated into the fabric of its society. Lizardfolk aren't naturally cooperative, working for themselves at their own pace, helping Valley in any way that they see fit. They can be direct, blunt, and even aggressive, but two are some of the most passionate and resilient of the animal folk. While they may seem stubborn and unhelpful at first, it's not born out of some unwillingness to lend a hand. They simply don't disguise their intentions with false niceties. They're known to grumble and complain, but see to the job's completion no matter what. Lizardfolk culture is one based on artistic expression, aspects involving heat and fire. Being cold-blooded, Lizardfolk are dependent on the sun and heat to give them energy. Thus, a religious order was formed with many Lizardfolk mastering magic that can create life-giving fire. Ritualistic dances, ceremonies, singing, and basking all take place at a central fire of every Lizardfolk village, with many going into professions that utilize fire, such as fire tenders, wildfire control, and forge masters. Lizardfolk are also renowned artists, using their deep passions and somewhat neurotic natures to craft truly awe-inspiring pieces. However, because of their need to always find something new and exciting to put their efforts into, their art is often destroyed shortly after its creation. This may seem odd to the other animal folk, but to the lizard folk, art is meant to decay, crumble, or be burned. You're only as good as your most recent work, and there's always room for improvement. So the old is discarded and something new, something better, takes its place. Ratfolk are what many consider to be the black sheep of the collective, the begrudging neighbors of Valley. While all Animalfolk of Valley lend aid to help build a prosperous place for all to call home, the Ratfolk do so in their own unique way. They're probably the least collaborative people of Bloomburrow, valuing self-reliance, intelligence, and isolation. But that wasn't always the case. Long ago, Ratfolk were seen as the foremost experts of Valley's history. They imported knowledge of all of the different species of Bloomburrow, and categorized ancient magical artifacts that helped to build this society. But a foolish figure in the past believed they could help defeat the Calamity Beasts if only they had the knowledge kept by the Ratfolk. Using that stolen spell, that figure almost caused a terrible apocalypse. Since then, the Ratfolk have grown inwards, becoming isolated and suspicious. Despite this, Valley considers them a crucial part of society. Ratfolk are still welcomed in with open hospitality, and they too reciprocate this offer, yet keeping what secrets they can through polite conversation. Living in the murky marshlands fed downstream by all the waterways of Valley, the Ratfolk collect pieces of Bloomburrow's history that float down to their home. They store this accumulated knowledge in great archives, allotting space for both mundane artifacts and plane-changing spells in equal measure. It's a rather lonely existence, and this isolation has led to some peculiar habits, such as befriending insects, using their special form of magic, which employs psychic spells that trap victims in a hypnotic trance. Ratfolk can dominate and bond mentally with less intelligent critters. Often these are smaller bugs and snails. These companions become strong allies, useful in both combat as well as warding off loneliness, as a Ratfolk with a snail is never truly alone. Birdfolk are unique to the cultural structure of Valley, as they're blessed with the gift of flight, making them some of the most useful companions in any adventuring party. Like the Mousefolk, Birdfolk are guided by a strong sense of idealism, bravery, and a commitment to defending the weakest in society. They act selflessly with grandiose, chivalrous deeds meant to cement them as natural-born leaders among the Animalfolk. Unlike their Mousefolk allies, Birdfolk are a bit more self-important and patronizing. While they do help others in need, they do so with a smidge of smugness. They risk their feathers in the pursuit of justice, but at the same time expect others to think a little highly of them for those deeds. This goes back to the Birdfolk's place in Bloomburrow society, having the ability to fly making them perfect scouts, couriers, and messengers. They naturally lead most parties with self-aggrandizing speeches that speak to the hearts of their companions, though can also come off a bit preening. Speaking of which, Birdfolk are notoriously vain, spending a lot of time cultivating their personal appearance and how they're seen by others in public. They will preen their feathers and adorn their plumage with symbols of their status and accomplishments, seeing their bodies as a means to reflect their ideals and honor their heritage. While going out and doing good for others is important, Birdfolk too take time to care for themselves. One of the greatest heights a Birdfolk can reach, literally, is through a trial known as the Plume Creed, a task meant to measure one's skills in flight and perseverance. It's a treacherous flight to the top of Bloomburrow's tallest peak, called simply the top of the world. If they can make it, the victorious Birdfolk is to plant a feather at the top and cast an ancient spell that binds them to their commitment to help others. It is this magic that Birdfolk go on to aid the people of Valley, weaving spells that enhance the combat prowess of others, even those without wings. While the Society of Valley mainly focuses on the already mentioned groups of Animalfolk, that's not to say other, more obscure species don't call it home. Though their relatively smaller numbers means their cultures are far less understood, they still make up the fabric of Bloomburrow and add their own unique personalities to its woven tapestry. Weaselfolk are known to be sly, mischievous, underhanded, and cunning. Many Weaselfolk wander the outskirts of Valley society, acting as hired guards or mercenaries, oftentimes for less than good-hearted clients. The most famous of these goes by the name of Cruelclaw, a title earned through dastardly deeds, including his theft of a Calamity Beast's egg, which triggered a nearly apocalyptic storm. Cruelclaw is but one example of Weaselfolk traits, but certainly he isn't the species' standard bearer. Badgerfolk are large, imposing figures that can't be missed when walking about the cities of Valley. Their size makes them by far the physically strongest of the Animalfolk. While their demeanor can often be quiet with an air of aggression, Badgerfolk, like hugs, can make great allies when they come in the defense of friends. They are fiercely loyal to those that show them respect, and their raw strength cannot be beat. Similar to the Mousefolk we already discussed, Bloomburrow is home to a species of Hamsterfolk, whom share many similar traits to their heroic cousins. Family, specifically their very large families, are incredibly important to Hamsterfolk, and so too is their tradition of gift-giving. A Hamsterfolk isn't worth much if they cannot bring a gift to a neighbor or other Animalfolk. To them, sharing with the society brings them more joy than taking anything in return. Possumfolk are dedicated solely to their families, especially their young, which they keep close and safe, even while meandering through the wilds. They commune with nature and act as guides through the bramble, while teaching their children all the great secrets kept hidden around every bend. Skunkfolk are seldom seen amongst the common folk of Valley. They're known to have a musky odor, which other Animalfolk find a bit off-putting. Despite this, most skunkfolk are kind-hearted and polite, doing whatever they can to make up for their scent. They aren't well represented in Bloomburrow, but one skunkfolk we see takes on an unlikely profession: assassin. Taking out targets becomes a bit more challenging when you always have to approach them downwind. Molefolk are a species founded in simple living. They take on roles throughout society that other Animalfolk would consider mundane, choosing it over the excitement of adventuring. Molefolk, however, find great pleasure in pursuits of mercantilism and hospitality. With their great digging abilities, many Molefolk act as druids who tend to the root maze, a great expanse of underground territory underneath Valley. Boxfolk are clever, nimble, and charismatic. They slither into conversations, guilds, and even relationships without ever being noticed, and are quickly welcomed in once they win you over with their charm. They have a certain sense for fashion, using their flair to add to their outward appearance while also distracting would-be attackers. Mr. Foxglove is a great example of an amazing foxfolk, one who blends adventurous courage with flashy charm. Turtlefolk are slow-moving, deliberate, and wise. Their relatively long lives allowing them to experience most of what life has to offer, meaning they act as mentors to other Animalfolk seeking knowledge from an elder. Turtlefolk live far out from the bustling cities, sticking to quiet nooks where they contemplate on life and learn lessons from their vast experiences. A famous Turtlefolk of Bloomburrow is Arkelos, whose ancient knowledge has made him one of the plane's wisest creatures. And still, there's even more Animalfolk not given prominent places in Bloomburrow, but are still just as interesting to learn about, which we'll do hopefully in a future expansion on this plane. And that, you guys, is going to do it for today's MTG Explained video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave this video a like, share it with friends, and become a subscriber to the channel. I'd also like to hear your favorite species in Bloomsburrow in the comment section below. Leave a comment explaining to me which Animalfolk you like the most, and I'll share my own favorite as well. As always, I want to thank you all so much for joining, and until next time, guys, see ya!